Okay, good morning. This is your instructor Andrew, and welcome to COMG 302 Research Methods. Yesterday we talked about the syllabus and laid out the foundation and expectation for this class. And starting today, we'll be talking about the actual content. And we'll start by introducing to you what concepts, constructs, and variables are and why they're important. So if you pay attention to the syllabus, you will notice that I originally planned two classes for concepts and constructs before moving on to variables. But then when I looked at the actual slides on concepts and constructs, I realized that they're a little dry without face-to-face interactions. And so I decided to uh, shorten the time that we'll spend on these two things, but then move more quickly to variables, which are actually more interesting. But then to understand variables, we need understanding of concepts and constructs, and that's why we'll still spend a little bit of time on them. All right, so let's see. All right, so concept. Concept is indeed one thing that we talked about on daily basis, but then rarely do we care about its definition. But then if we do think about it, and especially to think about it in relation to our daily life and all the things that we observe around us, its definition is actually quite straightforward. So what I said here is that concept is a term or a word that represents or we use to represent what is common about a group of things that we call phenomena. Um, and concept, is not a natural phenomenon. It's not like a rock that is just there. Instead, concept is more or less formed, is more or less constructed by our brains, by humans. And we do that um, by sort of looked at the commonalities or similarities um, that we take from specific cases of the phenomena that we care about. All right, so that sounds pretty abstract, and we can look at some more concrete examples. So if I ask you, how would you define dog? You can think about it, right? There are many ways to think about dogs or dog, this kind of animal. So let's imagine that you're meeting with someone from the Mars, a Martian, and they don't have dogs, and you decide to introduce to them this specific kind of animals instead of telling them one by one, oh, this is a Chihuahua and that's a Great Dane. How would you summarize this particular kind of animals to them, to the Martians? All right, so you can think about it. You can have your own version of the definition of the dog. My mine is that dog or dogs are essentially a type of animal that have four legs and they will bark. All right, so see here I extract some commonalities, something that all dogs have in common, and use these common features to refer to the phenomena that I'm interested in. Right? All the dogs are something that I'm interested in, and to describe this whole class of entities by using what they have in common. So by doing that, right, by forming this one, two, three, four, by forming this four-word definition, I sort of produce or invent a concept that people can readily use, right, to refer to uh, something that they're interested in. Similarly, beauty is another concept. And if this time asked you, well, what is beauty? Again, you might have your own version of the definition of this concept, right? Dog is concept, beauty is concept. Here it might say, well, beauty is something that looks pleasing. Um, that's great, right? So all things that are beautiful are indeed pleasant to look at. That is indeed a common feature of the beautiful things. So again, great. We just produce a concept, and we produce this concept by clarifying its meaning, right? By producing some kind of definition for it. One last example is happiness, right? So it is in the constitution of this country that says, everybody is entitled to pursue their own happiness. But then you may ask, well, what is happiness, right? Um, Again, here I say, well, this concept of happiness is actually referring to a whole class of mental states. Right? You can comfortably add a s here to make this phrase plural, so that it will refer to not just one state of well-being, but a collection of psychological state that we'll call happiness. So in these three examples, we have dog, beauty, happiness. So these are concepts. A word, right? That's one word, another word, a third word. So a word to represent something that's either very concrete or something that's a little bit more abstract, or something that is very psychological, something that we do not have direct observation of. So either way, right, you can see concept is a very useful tool. It is useful in that you can use a very simple term, a very simple phrase or expression to communicate ideas that might not be very easy to communicate if we stick to all these very long sentences. So that's concept. Constructs. Constructs is actually a type of concept. And it is a very specific type of concept in the sense that they are concepts invented for a very specific purpose, and that purpose is to conduct scientific research. So in other words, constructs essentially are scientific concepts. So we can sort of make this contrast, right? So we can talk about, well, there are some concepts that, we don't need to be a scientist to understand. So we call those concepts daily concepts. But on the other hand, we also have concepts that non-scientists do not use that often, or may not even know their existence. Nevertheless, those concepts, right, scientific concepts, they're widely known um, in certain scientific communities, right? Physicists, they have their own jargons. Uh, Communication scientists, they have their own jargons, and those jargons sometimes are, constructs. But to make this distinction or this contrast between daily and scientific concepts does not mean that daily concepts cannot be used in scientific research. That is entirely untrue. For example, we can easily formulate this hypothesis or this guess or statement or claim that says dogs compared to cats, they're better friends to humans. So we call this a hypothesis, and we don't know whether this is true or not. And we need to find out, and we need to find out scientifically. So in other words, dogs friendly or friendliness, and cats and even humans, we might say, well, all these are not that special. We talk about these concepts all the time in our daily life, so they're not necessarily constructs. But indeed, these daily concepts are still being used in a scientific context, right? Forming a hypothesis to be tested in some kind of studies. So, daily concepts, even though they're not specifically for the purpose of conducting scientific research, can still be used um, for science. The problem, though, is in daily life, we don't really talk about things, or we don't talk about things um, that scientists are more interested in. So we care about cats and dogs, but scientists think, well, cats and dogs, after all, are very common, so they're not interesting at all. And they're interested in something that's arguably bigger and more important. Um, could be. But anyway, the point is, daily concepts sometimes do not suffice the purpose for scientific research. And when that occurs, scientists will start inventing jargons and constructs to suit their own purposes. So, for example, if I ask you, well, um, what is the concept that sort of summarizes or describes the process of nature uh, taking out entities that do not succeed in adapting to their environment? Right? There's a concept that would describe this process, and I assume that many of you will know if you have taken Biology 101, and you might have guessed it, and that's natural selection, right? And natural selection is something that Darwin invented, right? So natural selection, in this case, is a construct. And it is construct in the sense that it is not something that we talk about in daily life, and it is used very often in a very specific context, that is to study how biological entities are in the form they are. As another example, right? And this is a sort of a state being that many of us, I would say, have experience of. That is, when you have thoughts that contradict each other, and when that happens, you will feel anxiety, you will feel uncomfortable, and it turns out there's a term that psychologists will use to describe this psychological state. So the question is, well, what it is, right? So if you've taken psychology classes and even commentary classes, I believe, some professors might have talked about it, and that's dissonance, right? And dissonance is a concept that Leon Festinger invented. So in these two examples, Darwin and Festinger, they could not find appropriate vocabularies in daily life to describe what they call the phenomena that they're interested in their own scientific enterprise. So they decided to coin some terms um, for their scientific pursuit. right? So these terms we call constructs. They're a type of concepts. So constructs are useful, but they do have their limitations. One limitation about constructs is that exactly because they're invented, exactly because they're often used to describe some very abstract phenomena, um, they cannot be directly observed. So when we say that something is directly observable, we might think of something as concrete as a desk, as a chair, or as a computer. Right? You can see it, you can touch it, you can even smell it. But that's not the case for something like natural selection. Right? Natural selection is, if we have taken biology classes, a process that spans thousands of years, and it's very powerful, but its power takes time to manifest, so to speak, right? So the fact that constructs are not directly observable does not mean that the phenomena that the constructs are used to describe do not exist. To the contrary, very often, in many cases, they do exist. Otherwise, scientists would not be bothered to invent a term to describe them. So again, if we return to the example of natural selection, we'll know that again, biology tells us that the reason that we're who we are is because of this process of natural selection. Right? It's the reason why humans are different from other species of animals, and it's why that humans and other non-human animals are adapted to their own environment. Well, anyway, this is not an evolution class, so I'll move on. The existence of the phenomena that we use construct to describe very often are inferred, and the inferences are based on the data that we collected in properly designed studies, right? And and those data we call scientific evidence. So, again, how do scientists know that natural selection is true? Well, they have many techniques that we'll not describe here um, to sort of make solid inferences about the true status of natural selection. Well, if constructs are that abstract, right, not as straightforward as daily life concepts, then why bother to have them? Well, one thing is, as we just said, constructs are necessary because daily life language or vocabulary does not provide the terms to describe those processes, those scientific phenomena. A second reason is that constructs sometimes they're very powerful in the sense that they can summarize a wide range of features about a phenomena. So, for example, if I ask you what causes the simultaneous occurrence of the following phenomena, right? So, what causes our heart to beat fast, testosterone to increase, and the contraction of muscle? At the same time, our eyebrows to lower, our cheekbones to raise, our nose to be wider, and our lips to be thinner. At the same time, what causes us to yell and attack, right? So all these are very diverse types of phenomena, and if we look at them separately and individually, uh, we are puzzled indeed by why bother to identify all these individual instances, and by themselves they might mean something, but a fast beating heart can mean many things, right? But then when we group all these individual phenomena together, we'll notice that collectively all these phenomena describe one single uh, uh, psychological state that we call anger, right? So in this case, anger is a concept, but in this case, it's also a construct that describes all these very diverse types of phenomena. So because of these features, because of constructs, the ability of constructs to describe um, interrelated but different features of a phenomena, researchers will be able to formulate their thoughts to propose predictions and hypotheses in a very clear way. For example, researchers can simply ask, what causes interpersonal anger, right? Uh, Instead of asking every time, right, what causes the physiological and emotional state characterizing the propensity to aggress. This is, you will notice, much longer and much cumbersome, and indeed takes more time to even read the sentence, right? Instead, we can use this one single construct here to replace this longer phrase, such that our communication and communications among scientists will be more efficient, right? So that's sort of the cost and benefit of using constructs. And in later classes, we'll encounter many types of constructs. So this is just to let you know what constructs are, right? So constructs, a type of concept, and specifically invented for scientific purposes. They're able to summarize a wide variety of features that are related to the same phenomenon. Okay. All right. So for science, let me drink some water. Um, just to have constructs is not enough. Um, Almost inevitably, we have to turn constructs to variables um, in order to actually carry out scientific research. So what does it mean? And let's explain this sort of thought or idea by looking at an example. The example is what Aaron Sell and his colleagues will call the formidability hypothesis. They invented proposed this hypothesis in 2009, so that's why this citation looks like that. So the formidability hypothesis is actually a very simple thought. It simply says the more formidable or powerful a person is, that person will tend to be more aggressive. Right? In other words, the sentence says there's some kind of relationship between a person's formidability or a person's sense of power and their aggressiveness. So here we can immediately notice some constructs or concepts, right, more broadly speaking, in this simple sentence. So first of all, we can say, well, first of all, we need to define what power is. So power can be simply how capable one is to impose some kind of a cost on other people, right? A person who's more powerful uh, can deliver more severe punishment, for example, on other people, right? That's what it means. They can inflict cost on others. Aggressiveness, that will be another construct, and we can say, well, we can probably define aggressiveness as loosely as one's propensity or tendency to attack. Okay? But then to verify the correctness of this sentence, right? To tell or to determine whether this is true, right? Whether it is indeed the case that more powerful people are more aggressive rather than, or, less powerful people are more aggressive. We need to collect some data and to see if the data that we collect actually agree with the sentence. So that's what we mean by um, testing hypothesis, right? This is a hypothesis, and we need data to verify its truth. But to do that, we cannot simply leave the sentence as it is. Instead, we must turn the key constructs or key concepts in this hypothesis to what we call variables.